Sure. I'm Ibram Kendi. I'm professor of history and international relations at American University. I'm also director of the Inter-Racist Research and Policy Center.
You were just appearing on a panel discussing punditry. Should historians be pundits? Is there a role?
Well, I think so. And I think that the author of the piece, who sort of was the genesis of this conversation, made the case that really academics or historians shouldn't be using, I guess we agreed, bad analogies. And so I think that historians should use good analogies and leave the bad analogies to the pundits, politicians, journalists. But it's hard to sort of find and construct great analogies, but I think that's our job as historians.
This was a piece that ran in the Washington Post last summer by Harvard's Moshik Temkin,
Yes.
right, in which had this somewhat outlandish headline saying historians shouldn't be pundits.
Yeah, and actually, it was the New York Times.
And what was it at the time? So,
Yeah,
sorry.
I think he was really sort of pushing back against a lot of the bad analogies that people had been using, including historians, particularly as it related to Donald Trump and who from the past should we sort of compare him to. And I just was emphasizing that I think analogies are useful, specifically because they meet the public where they are. I mean, most people in the public understand history through analogy, understand the present through analogy, and so I think historians should use them, but I think we have to use historically grounded, accurate sort of analogies that do not distort either the past or the present.
You know, one of the things we've been doing at H&M for the last 17 years is asking people to basically historians to be pundits. What we always tell them is what we're looking for is for you to help put events into context. I was kind of struck that nobody was talking about that. And isn't that what historians are always being asked to do, which is put events into context?
Well, I think that that's what our role is. That's what our job is, so people can make sense of the present. I mean, you know, people, for instance, make sense of themselves as individuals through their own past. And so certainly it's our job to allow them to make sense of their community, their nation, their world through teaching them, you know, about the past. And if that necessitates that we're identified as pundits, then so be it.
I'm Nicole Hemmer. I am an assistant professor at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia and co-editor of Made by History at the Washington Post.
Tell people what Made by History is.
So what we do is we publish 11 pieces a week by historians about the history behind the headlines. So where is all of this seemingly unprecedented news coming from, and how can we better understand it by better understanding our past?
The op-ed that was written in the New York Times castigating historians as pundits. What's your feeling about that?
Well, look, I'm definitely against bad history and bad punditry. That said, I think now more than ever, we need historians to be part of the conversation and to understand the kind of effort that goes into things that we dismiss as sound bites or one line in a New York Times article. A lot of times there's not only a deep conversation that's happening behind the scenes that helps to more historically inform what journalists are writing, but we're drawing from a deep well of historical knowledge. And so that little soundbite that comes out may not reveal all of the history behind how we reached our conclusion, but it is there and it is informing everything we do when we engage with the public.
You know, at H&N, we've been publishing op-eds now for 17 years. We've published 10,000 original op-eds in that time. It's been a lot. And what we always tell the readers and the writers, what we're trying to do is put history in context. And I spoke to Ibram about this, and is that part of what you see as your mission?
Well, absolutely. I mean, putting history in context and in a way, putting the present in context. It's so easy to get caught up in the ephemera of the day-to-day and to get caught up in the dynamics of the present. And there can be a way that you feel kind of unmoored in that, especially when the news comes at you so fast. So history doesn't just provide context, but it provides an anchor, kind of a rooting to understand that everything comes from something. It's not all sui generis, and that there is a way to better comprehend the world around you, and that history is a huge part of that. I mean, that's not just what we do at the Washington Post, but it's what I do in my career as a columnist and a commentator and a podcaster.
It does seem that, Americans don't know very much about history, and so anytime historians have a chance to at least sprinkle a little bit of knowledge there, isn't that helpful?
Well, absolutely, and I think that there is a tendency often within the profession to lament that the public doesn't know about history and then not actually do anything about it. We certainly get to interact with students when they come into our classrooms, but I think that there really is an opportunity to reach a broader public and teach them something about the past. I think there is a hunger for that. I think that there are lots of people doing really good work that's being read, so it's just about getting it out there and making it accessible.
What we're always saying at H&N is that historians come to their perspective differently than lay people or ordinary people looking at events, because they have this great deep well of knowledge about a subject. And so when something happens in the news, as a result of their deep knowledge, they see that event differently. And that is the purpose of these op-eds, is to help the ordinary reader see that event through the eyes of the historian.
Right, and Ibram used this great analogy during our session about the difference between a doctor and a layperson. I think this is something we can comprehend a little more easily. If I have a rash on my arm, I don't have any way to understand what that is except my own personal experience. I can be like, well, it doesn't look like poison ivy. I've had poison ivy before. But then I don't have anything else to go on except maybe Google. And if you've ever Googled a medical condition, it's a dark road to go down. And so I think that historians are operating in the same way. You can look at this confusing current event and you can say, well, it kind of reminds me of this other thing that happened 5 weeks ago. But what historians can do is they not only know events in the past, but they've studied causes and they've studied decision making and they've studied processes that help them not only better understand what's happening in the past, but can shed some light on what's happening now.
I think historians have a lot to offer the public in journalism, and most Americans don't really know that much history. The history they know about and care about is more personal history, I think, ethnic group history, religious group history, that kind of thing, and historians care about those things too, of course, but I think at a time like now where there's tremendously controversial presidential administration, where there's deep divides in the country politically, ideologically, and almost every other way almost you can think about, I think historians have a lot to offer in the public sphere to explain how things got this way, to talk about other times of deep division in American history. So I think it's really important. Plus, historians who write well, or who write at least clearly and have something to say, who aren't pedants, I think have a lot to offer. And there have been many great historians in the past who have been public historians in a sense. C. Van Woodward and W.B. Du Bois and Richard Hofstadter and many others. So I think there's a great tradition of doing that, and we should continue it.
A lot of journalists keep using the word populism to describe the moment that we're living through. Do you have a problem with that?
Well, I wrote a book on the history of populism as a language, as a form of expression in American history. And so I'm asked a lot to write about and comment on populism in general with a small p, not a popular p. It depends how you define it. To me, populism is a way of talking about the ordinary, hardworking majority who are being betrayed or robbed or corrupted by a small, immoral elite. And that kind of language has been used in many different countries at many times. And it's got a deep history in America, especially, I think, because we're a society built on, a nation built on the idea that people should rule, that everybody should have equal rights, though, as we know, that's not been practiced very often in America. And populism is often a way to say those in power are betraying the ideals of the country, which isn't always the way populism is used in other countries as well. And at a time when there's a sense that the political class in different countries is not listening to the demands of a lot of the people in the population, coming out of the Great Recession, which still has a lot of impact, I think, on people's consciousness in many countries, not just this one. It's not surprising that we have a wave of or a vogue, you might say, of populist language used by everyone from Donald Trump to Marine Le Pen in Europe, people on the left, like Mélenchon in France, and Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, to Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren in this country. So it's a way of evoking the interest of the majority, I think. It can be demagogic, it can be conspiratorial, all that's true. But at the same time, I think it has a real role. So this is a populist moment, if you will. We've had them in the past, often during times of felt crisis, and often both during and after times of economic downturn.
Some people on the panel were dismissive of what they call history by bad analogy. One of the historians' names who was surfaced in this context was Yale's Timothy Snyder. What do you?
I mentioned him, actually, yeah.
Yes. What do you make of his approach?
Well, his book, I mean, first of all, I should say that he's a great historian. I've learned more, I'm not a historian of Eastern Europe, but I've learned more from his books about Eastern Europe than any other historian. Modern history of Eastern Europe. That said, I think his book on tyranny, which has gotten a lot of attention, runs the risk, people who read that book run the risk of thinking, aha, Trump is like every other would-be tyrant in American history, or in world history, I should say, because in Snyder's book on tyranny, clearly the references to Hitler and Mussolini, to Stalin, other obvious totalitarian dictators is pretty clear, I think. And he wants you to watch for signs of that happening in this country. Well, on the one hand, maybe that's useful. On the other hand, I think it leads to a misapprehension about what's happening in this country, a misapprehension about American history, that we are as prone to that kind of takeover as other countries are. Perhaps we are, but he doesn't really make that argument. He just assumes that you think we are. And that's a problem, I think, in assuming that. It doesn't grapple with what I think is the deep legitimacy of American democratic institutions. I'm on the left. I don't think they're perfect by any means, certainly. But at the same time, I don't think even the Republican Party is about to support doing away with them, which is what would have to happen if we had a real tyrannical administration. And Trump is not an ideologue, unlike most tyrants. Unlike Kim Il-sung in North Korea, or Stalin, or Mao, or Hitler, or Mussolini, he believes only in Trump, and that makes him both vulnerable, I think, but also not a good analog to the other tyrants that Snyder, in effect, is referencing in his book.